This is episode 31 of the Women in Depth podcast. The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hi, and welcome back to the Women in Depth podcast. Today we will be talking with Janeen Herskovitz about the experiences of moms with autistic children. She will share some basic information about autism and then take us deeper into the experiences of moms with autistic children. She will share the unique struggles and fears that these moms experience, along with suggestions for dealing with the diagnosis of autism and navigating this experience. She will also share what these moms need most in terms of support from family members, friends, and loved ones. Today, my guest is Janeen Herskovitz, a licensed mental health counselor in Florida and owner of Puzzle Piece Counseling. She earned her bachelor's degree in special education from Rowan University in New Jersey and her master's of arts in mental health counseling from Webster University in 2010. Janeen is a trained EMDR trauma therapist and writes as a topic expert contributor on autism spectrum at goodtherapy.org. She has been married to her husband, Joe, since 1995, and together they have 2 teenage children. Janeen's podcast, Autism Blueprint, will be launching soon and covers a variety of topics surrounding living with autism in the home. Hi, Janeen, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Lourdes. Thanks for having me.
Janeen, today you are going to share with us some of the experiences and struggles of being a parent or a mom of a child with autism. And to start off, I was hoping you could share with us how you were drawn into this area.
Sure. Well, the main thing that drew me into this area was having a son with autism myself. My son, Ben, is now 19 years old and was diagnosed with autism when he was about 3.5. So I was actually not always a therapist. I became a therapist when he was around maybe age 13, 14. So I always like to say that it chose me. I didn't really choose it as far as the population that I serve.
And you truly have experienced a large portion of that parenting experience because he's 19 now. I mean, I know you're not done by any means, but you've really, from 3.5 to now can really speak to that experience.
Yes, absolutely. In probably every area of my life, marriage, my mental health, my self-care or lack of it, and, the educational piece. But that's, I think the home life is the part that I've really been drawn to in helping people.
So just for our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar with autism, could you share what it is?
Sure. That's a really great question. It doesn't get asked enough. Autism is considered a neurological disorder that affects just about every aspect of a person's life. It can affect speech, it can affect social interaction, it can affect motor skills and motor planning. Usually develops in childhood, and it's pervasive. And it's while I believe that it's very much treatable and that the symptoms of it can be ameliorated to a great degree, it is considered a lifelong disability.
So for someone who has the diagnosis of autism, how will that first maybe begin to show up as far as, perhaps a parent watching her child and wondering if something else is going on?
Sure. Well, the first thing that parents usually notice is a delay in speech. Sometimes they'll notice that certain skills such as speech and motor skills and things like that will actually go away. For my son, he developed typically until he was about 2.5, said his first words, hit all his developmental milestones. Speech was a little bit slow coming, but he had it. And then during the course of between ages, I'd say 2 and 3, he began to lose skills.
Interesting. So he had made progress in normal development and then almost like seem to regress. Is that what you're describing?
Absolutely. Yes. His type of autism was considered regressive. And a lot of parents will either notice a lack of eye contact, an inability to be around other children, or difficulty being around several people at once. My son would have a meltdown if he was around more than 2 people at a time. They tend to have they're defensive to sensory stimulation, so to speak, which in a child that young can be crankiness, can be wanting to be alone. So we had a lot of tantruming that just didn't make sense. We had limited eye contact. And something else called joint attention, which we don't always pay attention to, where most children will bring you a book even before they can speak and point to it or point to what they want, or, tug on your sweater and if a butterfly is flying by, point to that butterfly like, Mommy, look, even if they can't say it.
Right.
That's called joint attention. A lot of people on the spectrum won't have that. So they'll be lacking that joint attention.
Is the autism diagnosis, it's commonly made when they are young, is what you're saying?
Yes, that's correct. Although I have had, it's a spectrum of issues. So it can range from severe and nonverbal on one end, and you can have highly verbal people that have many of the other symptoms, so what we call Asperger's, which used to be known as Asperger's syndrome, which now it's all just known as one autism spectrum.
So I can see how for a parent, it's really difficult to put your finger on it with what you're seeing.
It's very difficult, and it's very disturbing while it's happening to you. And that's one of the issues that I see a lot in my office and had in my own experience, especially having a child that lost skills. You start to think that maybe there's something wrong with you, that maybe you didn't see it properly. But being my first child, I wrote everything down, meticulously in the baby book. The first time he waved bye-bye, and the first time he said his first word, and the first, all the firsts were written down. So I remember not seeing those things anymore, and then going back and thinking, wait, I know this was the day I saw that. I wrote it down. And then people tell you, oh, don't worry, it's nothing to worry about. He's a boy. Boys develop slower than girls, or Einstein didn't talk till he was 4. They tell you all of these things to kind of give you some hope, but what you're seeing. You know that something's not quite right.
Wow. I can imagine that it's just such a difficult space to be in as a parent.
It is. It's so difficult because during that time you're going through these stages of grief, so to speak, where one day you're thinking, oh, something's definitely wrong, and you're starting to go down that path of trying to find out what it is. But it can vary day to day. My son can have a really good day where he's not having as much trouble speaking as, say, the next day. And a lot of the parents that I talk to will say that their children have similar experiences. And you kind of, you cling to that hope of, oh, well, look, he answered my question today, so maybe he's not autistic. So you go through that, that bargaining and that denial and all of those stages of grief, and they just kind of swirl around. And the best thing I think a mother can do in that position is to talk to someone else who's been through it.
Yeah. Because I can see how, your own desire for it to not be so can cause you to focus on, like you said, he had a good day today. And
yes.
Also then looking at maybe, like you said, about your own parenting, I just need to, take him to the library more. I need to, we need to be more active. Or you can also look at, I'm a overprotective helicopter parent and I'm making something out of nothing.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes, exactly.
So to kind of go back to the basics of what autism is, I don't know if you have any of this, these statistics, but how common is it and what causes it?
Oh, those are the $1 million questions.
Are they? Okay.
Yes. So how common is it depends on who you talk to. The last statistic that I read from the National Autism Association, which is an organization I trust, I think had said it was 1 in 80 something. Okay. Maybe even less than that. It's something that, being someone that works in autism, I really probably should know the exact number, but it changes varying depending on who you speak to. it will change. It is more common in boys than it is in girls. And it is somewhere around 1 in somewhere between 60 to 80, depending on who you talk to. And that's a lot. If you think about the average classroom of children being maybe 25 children,
Yeah.
if you put 2 classes together, you'll have at least, one child that has autism spectrum disorder. And that's, out of the whole United States. So we're seeing it. I think the most disturbing part is that we're seeing this exponential rise. When my son was diagnosed, it was 1 in 10,000.
Wow.
And that was only in 2001. It's 2017.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
That
and so
is.
as far as what causes it, that would be something for a whole other podcast. And something that really depends, I think, and this is my personal opinion, it just depends on the child or on the person. So there are lots of different theories that have become more than theory because there's more and more science to back it up. There's definitely a genetic component that we know loads the gun, so to speak,
Okay.
and an environmental component that pulls the trigger. But I think that's true of so many
Right.
issues.
Yeah.
We know that about cancer. We know that about lots of different things.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking about an interview, a podcast I heard the other day, and they were talking about that study of the adverse childhood experiences and how childhood traumas, kind of like you said, prime the gun for mental health issues later, substance abuse, addiction. So definitely part of it is, like you said, it's biological, and then there's a environmental piece to it. Since we're talking about the causes, I know that there are a couple. I asked around and asked some colleagues and friends. I'm going to talk to an expert on autism. What do you want to ask her? And so one of the questions that came up was, you hear that it's caused by vaccines, or it's caused by having an epidural. With this, or it's caused by having a C-section. And so I just wanted to see if you could maybe address some of those and clarify if any of them have any basis, or are these myths?
So as far as those questions are concerned, there's definitely concern and truth to them. And I think that the truth just depends on what studies you're reading, because you'll hear about vaccines being linked to autism, and then you'll hear other people say, yeah, but there aren't any studies. I would encourage people to take a look at where the studies come from. Our pharmaceutical companies basically run the world right now.
Yeah.
So many of our vaccine schedules are being dictated not by medical necessity, but by money. So that being said, I also caution parents to do their research, but also to talk to other moms who have experiences that may shed some light onto it. My son is definitely vaccine injured. He was, we have lab work that confirms that he was vaccine injured. He was born with an immune system that was already compromised, and so that loaded the gun. And we unfortunately, following the normal vaccine schedule at that time, did damage to the immune system without knowing it. So again, that's another, we could fill a whole podcast probably with that information. And it's a heavily loaded one because, I look at it a lot like when I discuss religion with clients, everyone has a different perception, opinion, experience.
Yeah.
And I'm always very cautious to say, this is my experience, this is my child's experience. And I've met lots of other children as well who have a similar experience, but it's not everyone's experience.
And so what about epidurals and C-sections?
That I don't know enough about. I will say that what we have to remember is that anything that we put into our bloodstream is going to affect our brains. Right. So whether that's while the child's in utero or when the child's out of utero, we have to really take a look at what makes sense for us to put into our bodies. And that goes for food as well. Food and artificial colors and dyes and all of that. All of these things can affect the disease process.
And when you said that, you can be on a spectrum. What does that mean when you're talking about autism?
Yeah, great question. So I see a spectrum kind of, it usually when people think of a spectrum, they think of it as like linear, like with severe on one end, mid-range in the middle, and then slightly affected on the end. But I look at it more of like a web, like if it were a spider web, and you might have some areas that I'm talking with my hands as if you can see me. You might have areas that are like, say, for example, in my son, he can't have a typical conversation verbally, but he can understand everything that you say. So like similar to a stroke patient. He might have trouble making friends or, like extreme difficulty with social interaction, but he may be able to sit and do an algebra problem. Do you know what I mean? So you've got these disjointed skills. And unfortunately, what we end up doing is we end up looking at a child's verbal ability and measuring their intelligence by that verbal ability. So I think we're doing children, not only on the spectrum, but all children, a great disservice when we make an assumption that because they can't speak or utilize language the way that a neurotypical child can, that they are somehow less intelligent. And I'm finding more and more that that's just an inaccurate presentation of what they can do. Because in a lot of people with autism that I know, they have motor planning difficulty. So that if I say to my son, if I give him a keyboard, for example, and I say, tell me how you're feeling today, he can type blue, red, yellow, green. He can type all kinds of words, but he can't necessarily get the thoughts from his head to his fingers to type it out because of the motor planning inability. So we've taught him a method of typing where we actually do what's called supported typing. And we support his arms so that he can feel where it is in space. And then it's easier for him to get original thoughts out. But language, I've learned, and even just in the last couple of years, and he's 19, I've learned how complicated the language processes in the brain are. And that it's really difficult to get an accurate view of what a child knows and doesn't know and what their capabilities are just from a single IQ test.
Yeah, it sounds like in order to really truly know your child's capabilities in this, especially with autism, is you really have to spend the time trying different things, right? And paying attention and almost, you're talking about how unique the experience is and even how unique the possible cause or the developmental process is. And so it's also difficult to even compare yourself probably to other moms of autistic children.
It is. It's difficult to compare the children, but there are a few things that kind of stand out across the board. I have support groups for the moms, therapeutic support groups that I created for moms, specifically moms of kids on the spectrum. And I find that when I get them together, they're often concerned, if one woman has a child that's maybe even going to college, but has autism and has a little bit of difficulty in one or two areas. And then I have another mom, maybe of a child that was just diagnosed and is completely nonverbal. They wonder what they'll have in common. And they often find that what they have in common is the pain.
Wow.
They have the same hopes and dreams, the same concerns, regardless of where their child is functioning-wise, how independent they are. They're still going to be concerned about what are they going to do when they get older and graduate from high school? Will they graduate from high school? What is their life going to look like? What's going to look like when I'm not here anymore? How much help are they going to need? Those are all the things that can keep you up at night. And those are shared experiences that no matter where your child is on that spectrum, we all share.
So, Janeen, if you were to share, what is it like to live the life of a mom with an autistic child? Or, we can even make it smaller, a day in the life of a mom with an autistic child. Can you share what that experience is? And going from the external, so what the physical interactive experience is if we had a video camera, and also what her inner experience is?
Yes. For the mom, you mean, or for me in particular?
Well, you could do both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so just like everyone's experience is going to be a little bit different, I can tell you that for me and for a lot of the moms that I treat, the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is that we are completely exhausted. Our children, sleep is a very big, difficult area for our kids. They don't seem to need a lot of sleep. They don't seem to want a lot of sleep, and they have difficulty sleeping. So that same feeling that you feel when you have a newborn where they're up and down, that sometimes can last for years.
Oh, wow.
And I encourage parents, and again, medication is a personal decision, whether it's medication or supplementation that's natural or whatever it may be. But I encourage parents all the time. The first thing we need to do is get you some sleep. And so, not to get too far off track, but sleep is a very big issue. And I remember when my son was about 7, we had a doctor give us a very small amount of a medication that would help him sleep through the night. And it literally changed my life.
Yeah.
It literally changed my life. Sleep, I mean, Lourdes, being a mental health professional, sleep is so important and we don't give it enough credit.
Absolutely.
So sleep is the number one thing. The other thing that we all have in common is that it's very isolating. It's difficult to take our kids out in public very often because it's hard for them to navigate the sensory input that they're getting. It's difficult for them to transition from one place to another. So from home to the grocery store, the smells are different, the sounds are different. Their understanding of the world is different than the way we process things. And then if you add to that an inability to communicate your wants and needs and ask the questions that you want to ask as a child. Children are always asking questions.
Yeah.
Mommy, what's this? What's that? Where are we going? When are we going home? I remember the first time I put my son on a bus to go to school, he was about 6 years old, and he absolutely loved it. But when he came home, he had this humongous tantrum because he didn't think he'd ever ride the bus again. Now, looking at that situation, when I finally told him, the bus is coming back tomorrow and you can get on it again and we're going to do this every single day that you go to school, he calmed down and was like, oh, okay. But he couldn't ask me. He didn't have the ability to say, can I ride that bus again? So you'll have a lot of kids having these meltdowns, and I like to call them meltdowns and not tantrums because I think there's a huge difference. A tantrum is when a child or a person does something to get their or an
right.
adult has acts out to get their way or to get what they want. And you'll see that sometimes, obviously, in kids with autism, just as you see it in neurotypical kids. But a meltdown is when they just are so frustrated, and adults have those too, when they're so frustrated that they just can't cope and can't function anymore. And so they just fall apart.
And that makes so much sense because I think about if I didn't understand something and I couldn't communicate it, just the level of frustration. And then if things are going in a different way that is difficult for me, but I can't even verbalize that.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yes. And then, so getting back to kind of the day in the life, there's a lot of exhaustion. There's a lot of patience that you have to have in figuring out what it is your child is trying to tell you, what they're trying to communicate to you. If they go to school and they're not able to tell you about their day, you need to get a report from a teacher that can say, here's how the day went. It's just, I don't want to make it sound like I'm exaggerating, but I'm honest, being very honest when I say every area of your child's life tends to be affected. You don't have play dates with other children the way that you would have them with a neurotypical child. You need to kind of teach every step of the way the things that they're lacking. A lot of these kiddos also have a lot of medical needs. Many of them, 40% of them, I think the statistic is, have seizures. So there's sometimes very serious dietary restrictions as well. Either they have allergic reactions to foods or they have an intolerance to foods, where then their diet can become a concern. And you'll take out certain foods, but then when you go out to eat, you need to make sure that they also don't get a hold of those foods there. So as if the emotional piece isn't hard enough for you as a parent, then we're always thinking one step ahead in our house. And it's become our normal, where my husband and I have gotten to a point where we're just a team. We tag team. My son needs 24/7 supervision. Not all kids need that. So in the life of some people's houses, they need to watch their child 24/7, regardless of their age. And in other people's houses, they can sit their child in front of, an activity or a video game, or, the child can read a book or do homework on their own, things like that. So that's going to vary. But there's often a lot of therapies that you're taking your child to in addition to school. So there's a lot of running around. There's very little time for self-care. There's very little time for friends as a parent.
It just seems like it takes the normal, challenging, overwhelming experience of motherhood, and it's like completely amplified and on steroids is kind of what I'm hearing.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. When I was listening to your podcast a few weeks ago, and I can't remember for the life of me who the guest was, but you guys were talking about the experience of motherhood, and I thought, yep, that's what it feels like, but times about 1,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I can see how, just for these mothers, oh my goodness, what do you see in the moms that you work with? How does this show up for them, as far as, I guess, emotionally, psychologically, mentally?
Mm-hmm. Great question. I see a lot of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder.
Wow.
Yeah. And so there was a study that came out several years ago that said that the experience of the autism mother in particular was similar to that of combat soldiers.
Oh my goodness, Janeen.
Yes. So that's why I went back and got my training in EMDR therapy, specifically to work on that PTSD piece.
Wow.
And for people that don't know what that is, it's a specific type of trauma therapy that involves eye movements. And I've done it both with the moms, with siblings, with dads, and with people on the spectrum themselves. Because their experience, I'm finding more and more, is also laden with a lot of traumatic events.
So for listeners who are not as familiar with the therapy lingo, can you share what PTSD is, especially in light of mothering a child with autism?
Yes. So PTSD is commonly attributed, most people hear it about soldiers coming back from war. And what happens is it's basically an anxiety disorder that occurs after being through a great deal of trauma. And the brain, kind of in an effort to protect itself, at least this is how I view it, kind of shuts down because it just can't take anymore. And so if you think of someone that's on high alert, like a soldier that has to, with their gun, stay up at night at their post or whatever it may be, and someone is trying to kill them, if you are placed in that position for long enough, eventually you could develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Very often people might have panic attacks associated with it, depression, all of those types of things. So with the autism mom, if I take a mom, I'll use myself as an example. I have a son that I have to constantly know where he is, what he's doing. He can't keep himself safe. So if he's playing in the backyard, I have to make sure someone is watching him. He's also very smart, and he likes to escape from the yard when he can. And so there have been a couple instances where we've needed to call the police and have helicopters and dogs looking for him. So, parents' worst nightmare is to have a child go missing, but then have a child go missing that can't keep themselves safe and can't speak.
Wow.
And may or may not respond to their name. And that's completely frightening. So when that happened to me several years ago, and I ended up on the therapist's couch working on that, I thought, wow, I can't be the only one that's dealing with this. And I'm definitely not. I mean, there are events like that where a child might go missing, but then there's just that day-to-day combining lack of sleep with a constant worry for your child's well-being, fears about the future. A lot of these kids become combative, and they might hit you or kick you or destroy things in an effort to communicate with you, or maybe during a meltdown. So a lot of these things can contribute to someone developing PTSD. Never mind that you had a life before you had children, and perhaps you had a traumatic childhood, or perhaps, you had some things that might have loaded the gun, so to speak. So I like to say that autism doesn't often cause issues in parents, but it does shine a gigantic light and brings them all to the surface.
And, as you were speaking, I was just thinking, and this has to be such a challenge too, just for the parents' relationship, because this is a lot of stress that's with no end in sight. It's just an ongoing, like you said, this is day-to-day life. And so I can imagine that even for couples, there's an immense strain.
Yes, absolutely. And there was in my own marriage as well. And I say was because we really did work on it for quite a few years in counseling. And we have a counselor, I like to say, on speed dial, because in case we need her, we go in for a tune-up. But we did spend about 10 years in counseling on and off, working on our own stuff, working on our stuff together. And, my daughter has a counselor. We're just not ashamed of the fact that we cannot do this on our own, and we each needed our own support system. And we all now work together as a team to be as much of a coherent family as we can be.
So, Janeen, to kind of just go back a little bit more to the impact of autism on a mom, what are some of the other, I know you spoke about the depression, the anxiety, or the PTSD. Is there anything else that you wanted to add to that as far as their inner experience, how the impact of this diagnosis can show up for them?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of grief and a lot of shame associated with it. Almost every mom that I talk to says, I don't know if I'm doing enough, or what if I helped cause this? And I think once I talk to moms about that grief cycle and that what they're thinking and feeling is normal. I don't like to use that word a lot, but it's just kind of par for the course that of course you're going to question, did I do everything right? And, for those moms who did see a big change in kids after they were vaccinated, or maybe they were thinking of not vaccinating and then they did and their child developed autism, and, they'll just agonize over different decisions. Did they have a peanut allergy I didn't know about, and I can't believe I gave them peanut butter and didn't know it. And, so all of those things that moms struggle with anyway, anytime that there's something wrong with their baby, you always go back and say, oh my gosh, is there something else I could have done? Could I have prevented it? Did I do enough? All of that is very, very common for the moms that come in my office.
This is like heartbreaking, Janeen, to hear this because, because as a mom, being a mom is hard, and I can relate to everything you're saying as a mom, but I know that for moms with children who have autism, like I said, it's just a whole nother level. And so I just, my heart just breaks for them. I know too that, as a mom, you have your moments when you're not at your best,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. And you're not able to maybe, respond as patiently, or, you may be a little short with your child.
Yes.
And
yes.
And then, then the guilt after when you.
Yes.
And so like those mixed feelings where then, you get angry at yourself because you were human and you were frustrated, impatient, and maybe weren't able to respond, as lovingly to your child in that specific moment.
Yes. So there's a lot of, I think that's where I see my role with the parents that I help as being such an honor and so humbling to be able to sit there with someone and have them, feeling what you just described and say to them, you know what? Me too. I flipped out on my kid last week, and guess what? I'm supposed to know better. But you know what? I'm a human, and it's okay. Your kid's going to be okay. You're going to be okay. And here's what we can do to move forward. And you're not alone. I think there's just so much to be said for that me too experience. And that's why I've found that parents have come to me and said, I can't go to another therapist because I'm afraid if I tell them the stories that I'm telling you, they're going to call, the parent police on me because my life is so crazy. I mean, honestly, Lourdes, a lot of us, we have stories that we won't share with anybody. But like I said, I'm shameless. So I'll tell you that a few weeks ago, my son got out of the yard completely naked. He was running down the street and I'm booking it after him, like screaming, like, stop, and had to like take off the cardigan I was wearing, wrap around his waist and bring him home. And, I can laugh about it with parents now, but in that moment, when you're in that moment, just going, what in the world? What am I doing? And I know there are parents out there, if your child has autism and you've had that experience that you haven't told anybody about, you're either laughing or crying or both right about now, because it's surreal and it's extremely stressful. And that's when I literally had to call a friend who I know I can really trust with my stuff and say, my life, like, what the heck? And she was like, me too.
Yeah.
So you have to be able to ask for help, and you have to have people in your life that you can go to say, I don't know if I can do this anymore, because you're going to have moments like that.
And I would think, you're talking about the grief, because besides being a mom, every mom is also a woman, her own person with her own dreams and her own life, separate from the roles that she loves and she honors, but she also has her own sense of who she is, which, you mentioned the episode of Lost in Motherhood with Kirsten Goffney.
Yes.
And we spoke about that, the importance of moms having their own space, their own life. And I was thinking about, even that grieving process of how, like you said, is this my life? Like, what the heck? The grief and the anger around the life you have, and then the struggle with having to carve out or find the space for yourself again. And maybe it doesn't look the way you wanted or imagined or hoped.
Yes. Oh, that's huge. And that is, you just described what I do every day, for a job, is that I help people kind of find their new normal. And that involves a grieving process. So we spend time grieving the loss, what I thought not only my child's life was going to look like, but what my life was going to look like. I'm experiencing that myself lately with having a private practice, and my son, who recently, about a year ago, decided he wasn't going to go to school anymore. And we decided to homeschool him. Well, now I've got a whole, the motherhood and the professional world are clashing. And so I had to really pull out all the stops with my own self-care and self-evaluation and say, okay, what is this going to look like for me? And you can't do that. You can't survive that unless you have a village, so, quote unquote village surrounding you of support.
Janeen, what are, there are a lot of people around a mother or parents with autistic children. There are friends, there are other moms, there are family members. What are the things that the mom actually needs from these people in her life?
Oh gosh, what a great question. I'm so glad you asked that, because so few people ask that. I would encourage, the grandparents, the friends, to be super patient. It's a very big adjustment to find out that something is wrong with your child. And I say wrong in quotes as well. But when you're going through it, it's traumatic as a mom. And so often we need our family members to listen and to not make assumptions. At the same time, I know that grandparents especially, they're grieving too. I remember my mom telling me at one point, this hurts us doubly because we're watching our grandson suffer and then we're watching you suffer. And that's hard to hear.
Yeah.
Because even though you're going through this, the last thing that we want is pity. So there's a balance here that I want to encourage people in, which is to listen, be patient, but also not pity us. Because even though it is hard, and there are moments where we may, be frustrated or want to give up or not answer the phone or not be able to talk to anybody for a couple days, we also, we need people to check in on us. We need people to call and say, I guess it depends on the person. My friends, my closest friends know that when I'm going through a big deal, like my son, going missing and needing the helicopters and the dogs to find him, which doesn't happen often, by the way. But the last time that it did, I had a friend who lives around the corner that just texted me and said, I'm bringing over dinner and it'll be there in 15 minutes. And it wasn't, Janeen, what can I do? It wasn't, because I'll say, we're fine.
Yeah.
We're good. It's okay. But those that know me will just bring the dinner.
Yeah.
They'll just send the text and say, I'm thinking about you. I know this has to be rough. If you want to talk, give me a call.
Yeah.
So that's, you have to know the mom that you're dealing with, but I haven't met a mom yet that hasn't appreciated someone just dropping off a dinner or a gift card to Publix or, something that just saying, I'm thinking about you.
And if there is a mom who is listening, who is struggling with this experience at any place in the age range, whether, her child is newly diagnosed or her child is older, what are your words of wisdom for her, Janeen?
I would say, I think it's really important to talk to somebody about what you're going through. So, it doesn't have to be a counselor that has a child with autism, but they might be able to hook you up with a support group. There are support groups all over the United States because there's a lot of us. So getting together, I like the support group idea because it's usually run by a mental health professional and you can get the help that you need. You can also get the time out of the house that you need. So I think professional help is important, but also understanding that you're not alone and that you can do this. It's just going to require a lot more work as far as taking care of yourself. I mean, this is where self-care has to be on steroids too. So when your guest that we were just talking about a minute ago was talking about motherhood, was talking about 5 minutes and free things, self-care. I forget what she called it.
Microcare? That's what she called it?
That's it. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes. That was the best. I was taking notes as I was listening because I thought, I need this. Yes. The microcare, just that making a cup of tea and just doing it mindfully or taking, I'll tell my clients, if you can just carve out 10 minutes to get in a bathtub and lock the door and be by yourself for those 10 minutes and really just be there. It takes energy is the thing. It takes energy and it takes the ability to say to your family, this is what I'm going to do for myself. Because if I don't, I'm going to hurt someone, or it's not really pretty. I mean, that's usually, and what's really cool, Lourdes, is that even though all of this sounds very stressful and very hard, there are moments of joy and there are things that I have learned and continue to learn from my son about unconditional love, about family, about resilience that I wouldn't have been able to learn any other way. As hard as it is for the siblings, sometimes my daughter is learning firsthand what it looks like to really take care of yourself as a woman and as a mother, because I have to.
And I think, what you're describing are some of the, I guess the unexpected gifts or the light in the darkness. And I love that you shared about, what it's really like to love someone unconditionally and the unexpected gifts and lessons. And maybe if you could share with our listeners, what do you think mothers or families with autistic children, what can they teach the world? What can the world learn from them?
Oh, gosh, that's a really good question. I didn't see it coming. I think the word acceptance of things they don't understand and acceptance of things that might be very different than their experience, which is so needed in today's world.
Yeah.
I don't know a lot about issues like racism because I am, just a middle class white girl. But when I hear my friends of different nationalities and different color talking about their experiences, I often think about my experience as an autism family of being different or of standing out or of not being treated the way other people are treated. And while I'm not comparing those things in any way, it brings me back to, gosh, how can I relate? And I usually relate on that level. For my son, especially now that he's a young adult, he is misunderstood so much because of what the outside looks like.
It's profound.
Yeah, completely. And so when I say unconditional love, I mean, you've got to show love to a child who may not return it in the way that typically you would experience it.
Yeah. And I think too, like the acceptance piece, maybe some of our listeners have heard of this and you may have also, but, the concept of radical acceptance, because, I think a lot of times when we are in situations that, are not what we dreamed or hoped and they're painful, we really invest a lot of energy into kind of pushing back and fighting against it and being upset, which is normal and part of the process. Yet, if you can get to a place of accepting it,
yes,
there is a lessening of the intensity. It doesn't go away. It's still difficult, but
yes.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And I just experienced that myself recently, like I was saying before, when my son suddenly decided I was going to homeschool him. And I'm trying to run a business with a practice. And I was kicking and screaming inside, thinking, did this kid not get the memo? I have a life here and I'm finally trying to live it. And, when I really looked at it and just said, okay, what would you tell a client? I leaned into the discomfort and I went with it. And what ended up happening were things, again, unexpected gifts that I didn't expect. Time that I was able to spend with him. I thought we were kind of done. Okay, you're 18 now. Like the therapy is over and we need to move on. And
Yeah.
mom wants life. And it's not the case. He had more to learn. And then we were introduced to typing. And now it's opened up a whole new world.
Yeah.
And I had to be gently reminded that my first job is I'm his mom.
Yeah. Janeen, what are, your favorite books, resources, websites for moms in this area?
Oh, good question. I think I mentioned before the National Autism Association, that NAA is my absolute favorite organization. I think they're very well balanced. They take a well balanced view of the medical model and the nutritional model of autism, and they provide a lot of support for parents. Another one that I like is called TACA, TACA, Talk About Curing Autism. And the word cure is a little scary for some people, but they've got a lot of really great resources there about diet and interventions and things like that. As far as books, I don't often recommend books that are about autism because parents that have to live with it don't often want to read about it too. But I love Brene Brown's work. I love The Gifts of Imperfection. That helped me a lot. I love The Four Agreements because that helped me a lot too. And any books about boundaries, about personal boundaries, have been extremely helpful.
Janeen, what is the best way for listeners to get in touch with you, to learn more about your work, and to possibly work with you if they'd like to do that?
Sure. Well, my private practice website is puzzlepiececounseling.com. Peace is spelled P-E-A-C-E, but you can put it in either way and it'll still take you to me, puzzlepiececounseling.com. And then I'm launching a podcast about living with autism in the home, where I'll be sharing very honest stories, and just like I was today about my child running naked down the street. It'll just be very real. It's for parents and for professionals. I think it's important for professionals to understand what goes on in our homes. So, and that can be, you can find me there at autismblueprint.com, where if you sign up to be on my newsletter list, you can get if you're a professional, you can get a free best practices guide. And if you're a parent, you can get a self-care guide.
Thank you so much, Janeen. We'll be sure to put the links to the resources you mentioned on the show notes. And I am really excited about your podcast coming out. That's going to be...
Thank you.
You're welcome. I mean, that's something so needed. And I feel like it's another place where stories and experiences can be shared. So again, moms or, parents of autistic children don't feel so alone, and their experiences are normalized. It gives them permission to be in whatever spaces they're in.
Yes, absolutely. That was very well said.
So thank you so much, Janeen. I know that our listeners will really resonate with today's topic.
Thanks so much, Lourdes. I appreciate you having me.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Janeen. As a mom myself, my heart went out to the mothers who are raising autistic children, because motherhood is difficult no matter what. And when you add to it the layer of child who is dealing with a diagnosis of autism, everything is just magnified. The struggles, the difficulties, the challenges, it's just compounded. And I just have a lot of compassion for the mothers who are moving through this experience. I love how Janeen shared that although autism can look very different from child to child, the mothers of these children share many common experiences and feelings. What also stood out for me was the far-reaching impact of a child's autism diagnosis, not only for the child, of course, and this is not to minimize the child's experience, but for the mother and the father of this child. For show notes to today's episode, please visit www.lourdesviato.com/women-in-depth, where you will find links to all the resources mentioned. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please share with a friend or subscribe on iTunes and leave a review. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.